Hello viewers, welcome to K Diagnostics, Dio here. Today we have a 2010 Chevy Silverado with a 5.3 liter. In this video I'm going to show you how to remove and replace a front wheel bearing on this truck. The first thing we're going to do is we're going to remove the tire so we can get access to the hub assembly. So now let's remove the tire. Alright, so now I'm going to remove the tire. Alright, so I have removed the tire. So now I'm going to bring you here in the wheel well so I can show you what we're going to remove next. Alright guys, so after removing the tire, the next component we're going to remove is the caliper. The caliper has two bolts that hold it onto the caliper bracket. There's this bolt up here and another one down here. These bolts are 19mm bolts. So we're gonna remove these two caliper bolts so we can remove the caliper. Once we get it removed, we're gonna hang it here on this stabilizer bar. You have to make sure once you remove the caliper, you don't let it hang by this brake hose here. Because if you let it hang by this brake hose, the brake hose can break. So you have to make sure that the caliper's weight is not resting on the brake hose. So now let's remove the caliper brackets so that we can remove the caliper. So actually before we do that, we're gonna have to retract the caliper pistons first. So I'm gonna get a screwdriver and pry the caliper up. So what I'm doing right now, I'm retracting the caliper pistons. So I'm retracting these pistons so that the caliper can be freed up. So now we're gonna remove the caliper bolts. Right, so this first bolt is removed. So now we're gonna remove the second one. Okay, so the second caliper bolt is removed. Alright, so we removed the caliper bolt. So now the caliper can come out. As you can see, the caliper just comes out, and then we're gonna just sit it over here on this stabilizer bar. Okay, so we're just gonna hang it there. Just make sure it doesn't fall. Okay, so there is our caliper. So now we're gonna remove the pads. So the pads just slide out. You just have to pry them out. So right here, this is the inner pad. So now we're gonna remove the outer pad. Trying to do this one-handed, guys. So here comes the outer pad. Alright, so after removing the brake pads, so now we're gonna remove the caliper bracket. And the caliper bracket has two bolts. So there's this bolt over here, and then another one up here. So after we undo these two bolts, this whole caliper bracket will come out. So now let's do that. Alright guys, so I used this pry bar to crack the caliper bracket bolt. So I had to use this pry bar to crack them open because they were really tight. Okay, so I cracked both of them. So now we're gonna use our electric ratchet to undo the bolt. So we're gonna undo the one at the bottom first. All right, so here comes the bolt. So now we're gonna remove the second one. So actually, before I remove this bolt completely, I'm gonna have to do it by hand, because if I remove this bolt all the way, this caliper bracket is gonna fall, because I'm using one hand to remove these bolts and then the other hand I'm holding the camera. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna hold the caliper bracket with my palm here. I'm gonna keep it up while I'm removing the bolt with my fingers. So hopefully this caliper bracket doesn't fall. So right there. So I have the bolt up here. So now I'm gonna remove the caliper bracket. So here comes our caliper bracket. Okay, so the caliper bracket is removed. And when you remove the caliper bracket, you have to make sure that your caliper pins are sliding in As you can see, the caliper pins are going in and out freely. They're not binding, so that's good. When we put the caliper bracket back on, I will loop this a little bit more. So they're all good. So now let's get the caliper bracket out of the way. Alright guys, as you can see, the caliper bracket is out. We removed the caliper, we removed the caliper bracket. So now we're gonna remove the brake rotor. Once we remove the brake rotor, we will get access to the hub assembly. These hub assemblies were making noise. I mean, the bearing in the hub was making such a zooming noise. I don't know if you will hear it when I spin the hub. I hope you can hear that. It was making such a loud growling noise. Alright, so now we're gonna remove the rotor. There's a little torque bolt here that holds the rotor onto the hub assembly. So I'm gonna remove this bolt. Alright, so the retaining bolt is almost removed, but the rotor is not moving. So the rotor is stuck to the hub assembly. So what we need to do is we have to keep this retaining bolt on and tap lightly on each side of the rotor so we can break it loose from the hub assembly. Make sure you keep this retaining bolt on, because if you remove it while you tap it, the rotor can fly off and hit you in the face or hit or fall on your toes. You don't want that. So we have this retaining bolt still here. So now I'm going to tap lightly on each side of the rotor. So right there, the brake rotor is freed. So now I can remove my retaining bolt. So we can remove this tiny retaining bolt. Alright, so we can just put it right over here on the lift arm where we're putting the rest of the bolt. So now the brake rotor should be able to come out. So right over here. So the brake rotor is removed. So now we are down to the last component, which is the hub assembly. Did you hear that? Wow, this wheel bearing is completely worn out. It's making a lot of noise. Yeah. So now to remove this hub assembly, we're gonna have to undo 3 bolts back here that hold the hub assembly onto the steering knuckle. So these 3 bolts, 1, 2, 3, these 3 15mm bolts, once we undo these 3 15mm bolts, the hub assembly will come out. So before I undo these 3 bolts, I'm gonna disconnect the wheel speed sensor electrical connector. This hub assembly comes with the wheel speed sensor. So what I'm gonna do is I'm going to use this little pick here. So we're gonna pry this up. So I hope you can see what I'm doing. So we're gonna pry that up, and then I'm going to disconnect this. This electrical connector has a little tab here that we have to press and then pull. I guess I'm gonna have to do this. Let me see if I can do this with one hand. There we go. So I just got this disconnected. Okay. So now we're gonna disconnect this holder here, this plastic holder, this little plastic thing that holds the wire for the sensor. So right there, this is disconnected. So now I'm gonna disconnect this holder here, the last one. So this one you just push, you pry, it has tabs on each side, so you pry those tabs down and then push up. I mean push it in to release it. So right there, right here, so the electrical connector of the wheel speed sensor is disconnected and the wire is just hanging. So now we can remove the 3 bolts that hold the hub assembly onto the steering knuckle. Alright, so I cracked all the bearing bolts with the breaker bar. So now we're gonna use our electric ratchet to remove the bolt. Alright, so we have removed all the bolts that hold the hub assembly on the steering knuckle. So now what we need to do, we just have to tap the hub assembly out. So now let's get a hammer and tap the hub assembly out. Alright, so now what I need to do is, since I got all the bolts for the hub assembly removed, I'm gonna put my one hand on the hub flange, and then I'm gonna use the hammer with the other hand to tap the hub assembly out. So I'm gonna hold it so that the hub assembly doesn't fall on my feet once it comes out. So right here, the hub assembly is off. So you're just gonna lift it right here. So the hub assembly is removed. So we're gonna remove this splash shield. So we're gonna remove it. We're gonna take it off. So here comes the hub assembly. So here's the old one. So I'm gonna get it out of the way. So now what we need to do is we have to use a wire brush and clean up this bearing journal, okay? Or the bearing seat, however you want to call it. We want to clean where the bearing sits. So you have to use a wire brush. Okay, so we're gonna use the wire brush to clean up this entire area so that our new hub assembly can slide in easily. So I'm gonna clean this. Alright, so I'm done cleaning the bearing mount. So now I'm gonna wipe it down and apply a little bit of grease in this area. So this is gonna help the new bearing slide in easily. Okay, so that's just some anti-seize compound there. So now what we need to do is we have to get our new bearing and install it. So I'll get the new bearing here so we can install it. Alright, so here is the new hub assembly, and this is the part number. I hope you can see 94-258034. So that's the part number right there. So let's get it out of the box. So here is our new hub assembly. Can you tell the difference? This is like super quiet. So I'm gonna spin this. Now let me try the old one. I hope the camera is picking that up. This one is really loud. Listen. You hear? Oh, this is garbage. Now listen to this one now. So smooth and really quiet. Alright, so now we're gonna install this one. So I'm gonna get the box out of the way here. Now we're gonna install our splash shield here. So this one just goes one way, and this little opening here is for the sensor wire. So right there, so it's gonna go this way. So right there. So at this point, you just want to make sure that the holes on the hub assembly are lined up with the holes on the steering knuckle. So once you get all the holes lined up, and then you can start installing your bolts. So I'm gonna put a little bit of grease on the threads of the bolts. So we're gonna install the first one. So now I'm gonna install the second one. Alright, so I got the hub assembly bolts started by hand. So now I'm gonna bring you guys over here so we can tighten them. Alright, so look how shiny this new hub assembly looks. So now we're gonna start tightening this bolt. You kind of have to go progressively on all of them. So you want to tighten them evenly. So you gotta tighten them evenly, and you have to make sure that the hub assembly is not binding as it's been pushed into the steering knuckle. Alright, so we got the bolts installed, so now we're gonna tighten them. I'm gonna tighten the bolt off camera, and then I'll bring you guys back up so we can start putting everything back together. So right now the next step will be putting the rotor back on, and then the caliper bracket, and then the caliper. But before we do that, I'm also gonna replace the lower control arm on this truck. The driver's side ball joint is worn out, so there's excessive play on the ball joint. So you can't only replace one ball joint, so you have to do both of them as a pair. So this ball joint is combined with the lower control arm. So you have to remove the entire lower control arm to get this ball joint replaced. I know some people press them out, but I'm not gonna press them out. These ball joints, these lower control arms are pretty cheap, and the bushings on the control arms are starting to crack also. I don't know if you can tell, but the bushings on the lower control arm are cracking up. So we're gonna replace this entire lower control arm, and replacing the lower control arm is really easy on this one. This is a two-wheel drive truck, so it's a rear wheel drive. The front wheels are just dead basically. They're driven by the back wheels. So we're gonna undo this nut here for this lower ball joint. So I'm gonna undo this nut, and then I'm gonna undo the sway bar link. After undoing the sway bar link, I'm gonna undo these two 13mm bolt right here for the shock absorber. So these two here hold, the strut on the lower control arm. So after undoing these two, I'm gonna then remove this bolt over here. It's a long bolt and a nut that hold this side of the lower control arm on the body, okay? And then there's another one over here. So I'm gonna undo this one also. As I undo all these bolts, the lower control arm will come out. So I don't have to film removing all these bolts. So I'm gonna turn off the camera. This is really straightforward and easy to do. This can be tough if you have bolts that are rusted out. So these bolts look pretty fine. I don't think they will be hard to come out. So I'm gonna remove all these bolts and get this lower control arm replaced. So I will replace it off camera, and then I'll bring you guys back up once I replace it. And then putting it back together will just be the reverse process of the removal process. So I will get this replaced, and then I'll bring you guys back up so that we can install the brake rotor and the caliper bracket and the caliper. So I will get this lower control arm replaced and then bring you guys back up. Alright, so here is the new lower control arm. As you can see, it looks nice and shiny. It has a couple bolts. Once I removed all the bolts that hold it in place, it was pretty easy to remove. So now I'm going to tighten the hub assembly bolt. So these bolts back here, I'm gonna tighten them, and then after I get them tightened, I'm gonna install the brake rotor. After installing the brake rotor, we're gonna install the caliper bracket and then the caliper itself. So now let's tighten the hub assembly bolt. Alright, so I tightened all the hub assembly bolts. So now we're gonna install our brake rotor. Alright, so here comes the brake rotor. So I'm gonna put this little retaining bolt back on. So the brake rotor is installed, so now I'm gonna install the caliper bracket. So like I said, you have to make sure that these caliper pins slide in easily before you put the caliper bracket back on. So I'm gonna apply a little bit of anti-seize compound on these caliper pins. So I'm gonna apply a little bit of grease here. We're gonna do the same thing on this other pin. So right there. So now I'm gonna install our caliper bracket. And remember the bolts we removed for the caliper bracket. The caliper bracket has 2 bolts back here. So now I'm gonna tighten the bolts for the caliper bracket, and these are 18mm bolts. So I'm gonna tighten them. Alright, so these caliper bracket bolts, if you want, you can torque them down, but you just have to make sure they're pretty tight. So we installed the caliper bracket, so now we're gonna install our brake pads. So before we put the brake pads back on, if you were wondering the bolts that I was tightening these bolts right over here. So this one and this one up here, and these 2 bolts, so this one and this one are the bolts for the caliper bracket. These are the bolts I was tightening, and then these 3 bolts are the bolts for the hub assembly. Okay, so all these bolts here I tightened. So now we're gonna install our brake pads. So I'm gonna start with the outer pad. So the outer pad is gonna go on first, and then we're gonna install the inner pad. So right there. Alright, so since the caliper bracket bolts are tightened, so now what's next, guys? Well, the next step is installing the caliper itself. And you gotta make sure that the caliper pins are sliding in and out freely. They're not binding. So that's good. We just lubed them. So now I'm gonna install the caliper. So right there. So just push the pin in. So this is really easy to do. I'm just kind of struggling because I'm doing this one-handed. Okay, so the brake caliper is installed. So now we're gonna put the caliper bolts back on. Alright, so I got the caliper bolts started by hand. So now I'm going to use our electric ratchet to tighten them. Alright, so that's good. So now we're going to connect our electrical connector for the wheel speed sensor. So we're going to attach this plastic rivet here. So this little plastic bracket is going to go over here. And then this one will go over here, and then the electrical connector is going to be connected to this. Okay, so we're going to clip this on. Alright, so I got the electrical connector of the wheel speed sensor connected, and this plastic holder here is mounted on the frame. So right here the wire for the wheel speed sensor is routed properly. So now we're going to tighten the brake caliper bolts. Okay, so the brake caliper bolts are tightened. Okay, so everything is back together, everything is tightened. So now we're gonna turn the hub assembly and install the tire. Ooh. This wheel bearing is really smooth. So now I'm gonna install the tire back on. So that's it, guys. This is how you remove and replace a front hub assembly on this 2010 Chevy Silverado. So I hope you like this video. If you do like it, give it a thumbs up. If you don't, give it a thumb down. But if you do, you gotta tell me why so we can make better videos in the future. If this is your first time here, subscribe to the channel. Ring the bell so you can get notified every time I upload a new video. If you have any comments, questions, criticism, leave them in the comment box. Thanks for watching, guys. See you next time.